Happy Friday, Baylor College of Medicine and friends of Baylor. And I also want to special greetings to my friends in Paris and Rennes who wrote me in this last week. So why do we need to worry about the rest of the world? There are all these variants cropping up. That's why we need to worry about the rest of the world. And the rest of the world's still lots of hot spots. South America still is a mess. In South Africa, Namibia, particularly a lot of cases, Oman, Tunisia, Mongolia. Oh man, Mongolia. Anyway, it's really important that these places all get their virus under control because they will continue to breed variants. And not to be outdone, just as I was saying, there's a new variant, the Lambda variant from South America. So the Lambda variant was first detected in Peru and now accounts for 80% of the cases in Peru, and it's now spreading throughout South America. It's been detected in 30 nations, mostly in Central and South America, but also a lot in Argentina, Chile, and Ecuador, but also in the UK. So it's important that every one of these countries gets their viral burden under control, or we're going to continue to see the evolution of variants, and that's a big risk to every country that has a vaccinated population. Now, Israel has the most information because they're farther ahead of everybody in terms of having the population vaccinated. So there were a couple of papers that came out of Israel a couple of weeks ago, and they've been able to look at both reinfection, infection, escape, breakthrough infections better than any other country because they're pretty far ahead. So they did look at one study, looked at Pfizer's vaccine against South Africa and UK variants. And they were looking at people who got secondarily infected, or they tested positive after a second dose. This is sometimes called a breakthrough case. And what they found, not surprisingly, was that the vast majority were from South Africa and UK variants and not the original strain. So they didn't test Delta variant, which of course everyone's concerned about, but the Ministry of Health in Israel reported that there's been a significant decline in the efficacy of the vaccine since June. So it's only about 64% effective at preventing infection and symptomatic illness, and that's because the Delta variant is going. Now, they haven't proven every one of those cases of resistance or the Delta variant, but it's probably pretty obvious that it is. The good news is that there's still a strong efficacy for preventing serious illness and hospitalization, almost 93%. But if you look at what happened in Israel, they had fallen down to 5 cases a day. I mean, almost disappeared. And then all of a sudden, they're having about 300 cases a day. About half of those cases are in children who weren't vaccinated, but the other half are in cases of people who were vaccinated but having breakthrough events. And you can see this very clearly on this curve that Israel was very down low, very, very low number of cases, and now is trending upward. So the Delta virus remains the kind of hot topic in the news because most of those breakthrough infections in Israel are thought to be due, at least half of them are due to the Delta virus. Now it's interesting because the WHO has now making recommendations different from the CDC. And as you know, I've said this when people say, well, are we all back to normal? I go, well, I'm not quite back to normal yet. I still don't go hang around with 1,000 people or 5,000 people because while the vaccines are very efficacious, there's still a chance that you can get infected and get sick from it, particularly with the Delta variant being around. So the WHO now has urged fully vaccinated people to wear masks indoors and to take other measures like social distancing to prevent infection. And that's obviously very different from what the CDC has recommended, where they've said now if you're fully vaccinated, you can pretty much do anything indoors and you don't have to maintain social distancing. And they also say you don't have to be quarantined or tested after exposure to someone who has had the virus. But because the Delta variant is 40% more transmissible than the Alpha variant was, and it has now suddenly emerged as the most dominant variant in the United States. Just 2 weeks ago it wasn't, but 2 weeks later it is now 51% of the variants in the US. So because of the Delta variant, a lot of places in Europe are rethinking their policies. They're starting to reinstate travel quarantines. Several Australian cities are in lockdown. And of course, more and more athletes are turning positive right before they go to the Olympics. So the Japanese are going to push forward, but I don't know. That doesn't look good. Britain, which has about the same number of people vaccinated as we do, about half the country's been vaccinated, they have postponed lifting their COVID restrictions for a month because they keep seeing the number of cases doubling every 9 days. So they're back to, slowing restrictions. And of course, not to be outdone, there's now a new Delta Plus variant. It's only slightly different. We don't really know that much about it. It has a small change in the spike protein structure, but it's enough to change it so that the monoclonal antibodies are no longer effective at treating. So that is a little bit of a concern. There have only been 200 cases that have been reported of this Delta Plus. We don't know if it's worse, but we do know it escapes the monoclonal antibodies, so we'll be watching that. But it's not spread around enough to be considered a variant of concern. Well, how about in the U.S.? Well, we're doing okay. So it's kind of like a tale of two worlds. The places that are vaccinated are doing well. The places that are not vaccinated very much aren't doing as well. So as a nation, we're down to about 12,000 cases a day. We're averaging fewer than 300 deaths a day, which is fantastic. But as I mentioned, the Delta variant is now the dominant strain, and it's driving up cases, particularly in Missouri and Wyoming and some of the southeast states. And this is happening at the same time our vaccination rate is dropping. And what's amazing to me about this Delta variant, if you look just 2 weeks ago, the Delta variant accounted for 30% of the cases of all the variants. 2 weeks later, it's 51% of cases. So it is really dramatically changing. And similar to what's happening in the UK and Israel, you can see that we plateaued and now we're beginning to tick up. And even though our case number is low, we had a 15% increase week over week from last week. And unfortunately, we still have less than half of the population fully vaccinated. 47.5% of the population of the U.S. has been fully vaccinated, and 55% have had one dose. But almost 10% of the people haven't gotten their second dose, and there's some concern that people aren't getting the second dose, and that's not going to be good for the variants. So we've got to keep enforcing the importance of getting vaccinated. Now, if you look at the hot spots in the United States, it's really pretty amazing. There are certain states that are just not doing very well. Missouri, Arkansas, Louisiana, some parts of Texas, and then the mountain states, Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, and Nevada, also have not done that well. But the real question is, how well are those states doing with their vaccination status? And the three ones that are most concerning are really Wyoming, Missouri, and Arkansas, because they are not only having hot spots and a lot of infection, but they're also low on vaccination rates. So when you start thinking about where do you not want to go, where I do not want to send my family and children, I wouldn't be sending them to the Mountain West or Arkansas, Missouri. Those are hot spots and low vaccination rates, so lots of virus in the community. In Texas, we have 4 counties that are not doing so well. Dimmitt, of course, Concho, Hopkins, and Shelby. The rest of the state's doing okay. They're doing okay. In the Houston region, we're doing pretty well, but as I've said many times, our R number is not going down. It's staying right where it has been. It was 0.91 for this week compared to 0.79 last week. We have about 3.1% of our COVID tests coming up positive versus 2.4% last week. We still have 133 new cases a day. That's 133 people a day in Houston. That's still a lot of virus. And 51 new admissions every day. So, we're not down to the point where I feel that the viral burden in the community is so low we can all just, pretend everything's all well. And one of the things I've mentioned a couple of times, but now that the vaccines are available, every one of these new cases, every death, every hospitalization is completely avoidable. It's really the absence of vaccination that does it. And if people think that they're not going to be infected, if that's one of the decisions they're making about not being vaccinated, they're wrong. This virus will find you. This virus is in the community. If you're not vaccinated, you get exposed, you will get the disease, and that's a real problem. So last week I answered a lot of questions. A lot of questions were like, well, where's it a risky behavior for if I have kids that are unvaccinated? And we've been saying all along, it's the same places that have always been high risk, gatherings, particularly multifamily gatherings. Well, there were birthday parties, classic example. JAMA just had a paper last week that looked at 2.9 million households and who had looked at results within 2 weeks of a birthday party. And guess what? 10 to 16 more cases were diagnosed in kids after a birthday party, if they had a birthday party within 2 weeks. And adult birthday parties, 6 more cases in the setting of having an adult birthday party. So it again shows that getting these small social gatherings are bad, and apparently kids' birthday parties are worse than adult birthday parties. So, but again, we've said it before, said it again, these kind of social gatherings. And of course, we mentioned weddings. Well, Joe Petrosino's group just reported an interesting case study, a wedding in Houston that took place over 4 days. They had about 100 people at each event. All the guests were asked to be vaccinated. So everybody's been vaccinated, except for the fact that 2 guests were departing from India 10 days after receiving a second dose of Covaxin vaccine. Now, Covaxin is a vaccine that was developed in India. It's a traditionally killed virus vaccine. It's not the mRNA vaccines. And it's thought to have about a 74% efficacy against the UK variant and 65% against the Delta variant. And everybody was PCR negative. Guess what happened? 6 positive cases developed. The 2 guests from India were likely the ones that brought it. It was a Delta virus. 2 guests from the U.S. who were fully vaccinated. In other words, they were vaccinated and they thought to be protected, but 2 guests got it who had Moderna, and 2 guests got it who had Pfizer. So those are breakthrough cases. In other words, they were exposed to the virus having been vaccinated and still got sick. 1 patient from India actually passed away. And then 1 from the U.S. had a severe case that required a treatment with monoclonal antibodies. So one of the patients who'd been vaccinated still got pretty sick from the Delta virus. And what that shows is that the Delta virus is bad. It's more infectious, and you can still get it if you're vaccinated. It doesn't happen very often, but it's a reason to be vaccinated. And one of the patient who had a less efficacious vaccine died. The one that had a better vaccine survived. So I don't know how many different ways to say you should get vaccinated. And of course, there was the outbreak at the church camp that was recently reported. 450 people, including 6th to 12th graders, participated in a camp from June to 23 to 27 in Giddings, Texas. This was sponsored by the Clear Creek Community Church. So far, 57 confirmed cases. Oh, just one other thing. They were in a bus for 2 hours. No masks were required. So what have we said all along? You put a bunch of people together, multi-households. I talked about camp the other day. Make sure that there are cohorts. If they're in confined spaces, be sure you're wearing masks. They didn't do any of that stuff. Well, they had, of the 450, 57 confirmed cases in kids who attended the camp. 90 additional cases have been self-reported. 6 of those cases were breakthrough cases of people who had been vaccinated but got sick. So far, they've identified the Delta variant in several, but most people expect around half of those people, almost 250 of them, will likely end up having the disease from 450. So it just gives you some idea of how if you ignore the fact that this virus is around and you pretend everything's good, there's going to be a lot of people who get infected. And so far, just to give you sort of an overall summary, there have been 154 million people who have been fully vaccinated, but there have been about 5,000 reported breakthrough infections who were hospitalized in the United States, and about almost 900 have died. Of the hospitalized cases, 30% were thought to be unrelated to COVID. Of the almost 900 that died, 25% have been unrelated to COVID. But the fact is, people are getting sick, not a lot of them, and you can get sick, hospitalized, and die even though you've been vaccinated. But it's a much, much rarer event. So the vaccines are very, very effective. But if you hang around in large groups of people with high risk, you expose yourself to risk, which is why I've said many times I personally do not feel comfortable in very, very large settings. Last week we talked people have a lot of concern about pregnancy, and we've been, for whatever reason, these rumors about the vaccine causing sterility and infertility continue to bother people. Well, there's the other side of it. So there was a recent report of the number of pregnant women who've been infected with COVID. So there have been 99,000, almost 100,000 cases of people who were infected, pregnant and infected. 17% of those were hospitalized. It turns out if you're pregnant and get COVID, it's a lot worse than if you're not pregnant. So it's actually a higher risk for it being severely ill and being hospitalized. It's hard for me to understand what the problem is. The overall risk of severe illness is is low, but it still happens, and the risk for getting severe illness from COVID with pregnancy lasts for 42 days after pregnancy. So the other thing is there's high risk for preterm birth delivery if you get COVID while you're pregnant. So there's high risk for getting COVID when you're pregnant. There's no impact of having the vaccine. I don't know. I don't get it. People should just get vaccinated. The issue with the myocarditis among mRNA recipients has been reviewed again. Just to put it in context, there's this case where there have been about 40 cases per million of young males in particular getting a myocarditis, pericarditis. It's treatable, but it is a significant issue. It's very rare, but just to put it in context, so for every million second doses of vaccine given to people under 30, you would prevent 11,000 COVID cases, 560 hospitalizations, 138 ICU admissions, and 6 deaths. That's from the vaccination. Compared to the complications of the vaccine, 39 to 47 treatable myocarditis cases, which led the FDA review committee to say, of course, the risk-benefit is clearly beneficial. It's a rare complication, but it prevents so much illness and death, it's still very important. And I want to finish with one really good news piece of data that came out of WashU, Dr. Elabetti's group. It turns out you get a very persistent immune reaction when you get the mRNA vaccines. We reported a paper of theirs a couple of months ago showing that in bone marrow you can identify highly reactive immune cells. They looked at 41 people that had a history of infection with the virus but also were vaccinated and they actually took samples from lymph nodes. And what they showed was that there are highly active germinal centers that last for over 8 months. This strongly suggests that these mRNA vaccines induce a long-lasting immune response that could last for a long, long time. And frankly, it's longer than everybody anticipated. So unless the variants avoid the vaccines, which could happen, if we're really lucky, these vaccinations should be able to last for longer than a year, maybe 2 years, maybe even longer. So the mRNA vaccines are really shown to be tremendously efficacious and long-lasting. So I want to end with a bunch of shout-outs. In particular, I want to acknowledge all the people, all the places that are coming up with creative solutions to vaccination. I myself would recommend, if I owned a bar, I'd be giving first drink to anyone who had a vaccine. Well, bars are doing that. Healthcare leaders are going door to door. The rideshare companies are now offering free rides to vaccine sites. Some states are doing lottery tickets. In Florida, a group of teens created a campaign to get the word out about vaccines to help their peers make educated choices. And all the professional sports teams have been offering vaccines and free tickets to games. I give a shout out to the Astros and Methodists for doing that here in Houston. I also want to do a special acknowledgement to our PA class, our physician assistant group. That the 50th class began classes this week, so that's a giant landmark. And I want to finish today with a happy birthday shout out, 70th birthday for Elaine Eckmark. Glad you follow us, and thank you, and have a great birthday. And I will see you all